y'all, welcome. Today we're going to focus on two big aspects that influence our text's overall readability: cohesion and clarity. So let's get into it. We're going to answer two questions. First, what are some causes of writing that seems awkward, confusing, lacking in that flow we're looking for? And how can we identify and fix these in our own writing? What we're really talking about today is something most of us think of as flow, or at least aspects of it. And because it's difficult to actually notice the flow of writing unless there's a problem, let's take a second and identify the kind of problems we're actually talking about. When a text flows well, it just simply works, right? It's clear, it's easy to read, and each idea feels well connected and smooth, like a nice road with no bumps or surprises, or like a nice solid metal chain where every chain link connects to the others. Now, in contrast, how would you describe writing that doesn't flow well? I think metaphors and analogies can be really useful for helping us understand complex concepts. So, if good writing is like a metal chain, what analogy or metaphor do you have for writing with bad flow? Write your analogy in the chat, and it'll really help us, I think, to recognize bad flow when we see it in a text. So a big part of what we mean when we talk about that mysterious flow is actually cohesion. Formally speaking, there are two aspects to cohesion. It refers to how the united, complete piece fits together, and also to how each individual part fits and connects to the parts around it. So the relationships between individual parts and the relationships of every part to the whole. And I think you're already familiar with clarity, of course. That's the quality of being clear. In particular, a clear text is one that can be read and understood quickly. Before we get too far, though, I want to point out that cohesion, clarity, and flow in general can really go wrong at multiple levels in your text. For example, the reason a text is unclear could be because the argument is poorly structured. That's not what we're focused on today. Instead, we're looking at the sentence and paragraph level problems that seem to come up very often in academic texts, especially since English has an expectation of a much more explicit level of cohesion than some languages. And to some people, it can kind of feel like we're holding the reader's hand and walking them through it maybe too much. In another video, one about being concise and precise, I talk a little bit more about this, so check that one out. Okay, so we're going to investigate three main causes of problems today. And the first one happens when this rule is ignored. This rule of putting old information before new. It's easier to show you than to describe it, so let's take a look at these two examples. Which one is easier for you to read and follow and understand? Go ahead and pause the video. If you notice the second one is easier to follow, it's probably because of this old before new business. Do you notice how for the one on the right, each sentence gives a more obvious connection to the sentence or the info that came before it? I've represented this here with this old before new aspect in red and blue just to help you notice it. The one on the left, in contrast, seems to start each sentence with like a totally new bit of info, which means the reader isn't really sure how it fits in, how it coheres, until we get to the end of each sentence, right? Now, we have a strong preference in English for predictability. So when we're not sure how to understand a sentence until we finish reading it, we get very easily distracted. But the one on the right seems to follow our predictions very well. Somehow it feels smooth rather than bumpy, right? That's flow, baby. Okay, so let's try to take both the reader and the writer's perspective with this one. Let's imagine that our text starts out this way. The biological clock is a master clock that dictates the day-night cycle of activity known as circadian rhythm. So what do you predict the next sentence will talk about in this text? For me, I'm going to assume it will probably talk about circadian rhythms. Now, as the reader, how satisfied are you with this text so far? Is it smooth or bumpy? Does it match your predictions or no? Okay, how about this one? Notice how we reorganize the information in the sentences a bit so that it kind of follows this old before new rule better. Does it fit our predictions better as well? Okay, here's our next issue. Using meta-language to improve our cohesion. Let's look at an example to see how meta-language works to create better cohesion and clarity and flow in a paragraph. So take a minute to read this and notice the effect of the meta-language that's underlined. Go ahead and pause. Okay, so what exactly is meta-language? Basically, these are the words and the phrasings we use to make the flow of our ideas more clear and often more concise, too, by the way. When we think of those transition type words, we often think of these two types, the relationship words and phrases, for example, regardless or however, and maybe the coordinators or subordinators like because or if or but. But here I want to point out that other types of words also provide meta language, like provide clues on how our ideas stick together. For example, we have any number of organizational words. Maybe they're time related or space related, like above that, below this, etc. Or other types of ordering and organizing words. We also have the careful use of pronouns. And that's not one many of us think about, but we certainly notice when reading something that contains an agreement mistake, like someone chose the wrong pronoun to refer to something, and so we're not sure if like they mean these things or those people, etc. This is a more subtle one that you're probably more likely to notice in your first language, but definitely is apparent when accuracy checking your text in a second language as well. We also have the ways we reference previous ideas or information in general with words like the aforementioned or previously described, but it could also be more subtle, like, describing an idea in one paragraph and then in the next paragraph, starting off with, this means that blah, blah, blah. Well, what is this in that case? It's the idea we were just talking about, right? We also have ways to use repetition and consolidation, which can also be pretty subtle. A lot of writers complain to me that they feel their text is repetitive in the words they've used. And sometimes I just have to say, like, if you don't repeat the same word for your key ideas, are readers really going to connect those different things? Like if you call it a device in part A, and then an instrument in part B, and a tool in part C, are we really sure you're talking about the same thing? Remember that we are on the outside of your topic and you, the writer, are very much on the inside of your topic and familiar with it. Okay, so likewise, consolidation is how we use hierarchies and categories when writing. For example, we have different types of groceries here in the example, but in a real text, maybe we're like listing the types of species we used for a laboratory experiment. We had mice, we had rats, we had hamsters, we had gerbils. And in the next paragraph, we might just say the rodent subjects. Well, anyone who knows that all of these animals are rodents will immediately know what you mean without listing them again. And most people will figure it out as well and maybe learn a new word, which is rodent. The last thing I want to point out is parallel structures and parallelism in general. This one is something I talk a lot about with second language writers. Here we have a pretty simple example. The procedure will have to include calculating the margin of error, analyzing the initial results, and recalibrating the device accordingly, and then a comparison can be made. So this list works and it's easy to read because all the things we're talking about have the same form, this verb-ing form. And that helps the reader know immediately that they're all on this same list of what the procedure includes, and to know like when the writer has moved on from the list immediately. But when we don't do this type of parallel phrasing, the reader might get the impression that the text is sloppy or a little bit confusing, and it can really be distracting. So, like a lot of things in writing, it's easier to notice the effect of meta-language when it's absent or it's not working. So how about this example? It's the same topic in basic text as before. But how much longer does it take to read compared to the earlier example that was exactly the same, but formulated to have a lot of good meta-language connections? Go ahead and pause and take a look. Now, let's talk about our third and final issue for today, trace distance. This term refers to any one of the subtle relationships created in our language. And the best way to describe it is that when something is opened, it must be closed. If we're having a conversation, for example, and suddenly I just say, so yesterday I ... but then I get quiet, you're going to be like, okay, yesterday you what? What happened? See, we know what's missing. We're waiting for the action, for that verb that goes with the subject of I. This is one of the most basic trace relationships, subject to verb. But let's look at some others. We have also the beginning of a standard phrase to its end, like take something into account. Take into account is a common phrase, and it's common to stick something in the middle of it. But the question sometimes is how long that something can be before we get distracted and start looking for the end of the phrase. This is an easy fix, though. We can certainly just say, take into account something long or complex, instead of take something long and complex into account. We also have the beginning of any sentence to its main action. This one is tricky in academic writing especially, and for German speakers especially, because of the way the main verb tends to get pushed to the end of the sentence, either in German or in academic writing because we're using a lot of passive verbs, or maybe lots of like introductory phrases or other types of phrases, like in the final blah, 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 despite the XYZ, and before continuing the ABC, blah, blah, blah. We still haven't gotten to the main action yet. But in English, we always want to try and push that main action in a sentence as early as possible. So instead of, in this work, blah, 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 XYZ is shown, we can just say, this work shows, blah, blah, blah. That's a great case for avoiding passive voice as well. Next, we have any verb to its object or object information. This doesn't just include typical phrases like that take something into account versus take into account something, but almost any verb phrase. And this one's useful to keep in mind because many second language writers especially don't realize how flexible the objects of English are. First language writers as well, because we tend to do this a lot more in writing than in speaking, to move the objects around. Now, that means we can move these items around as necessary, basically. For example, if they're long, or to follow that old before new rule, etc., if we're trying to make the sentence as clear as possible. Then we have the beginning of any interrupted phrase to its return or its conclusion. This one happens oftentimes when we're packing a lot into one sentence and interrupting or embedding phrases with other phrases. These too can be moved around oftentimes. So for example, we could say, despite blah, 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 this fails to satisfy us as readers. And now we haven't interrupted our verb phrase fails to satisfy us. Now it's time for you to practice. Check out these 3 unrevised sentences from real academic texts. Go ahead, pause the video, and in the chat, write your revisions that would work to improve the cohesion and the clarity of each sentence, especially when it comes to those trace distances. And go ahead and make some major changes if you want to. You don't have to just change 1 or 2 words. Now let's try one more practice. This paragraph comes from a research proposal, and it has definite problems in cohesion and clarity. Go ahead and pause the video again and rewrite it so it flows better. And you're probably going to find issues from all 3 of the categories we've talked about. So how'd you do? If you skipped over the practice, which I bet you did, I really recommend you go back and actually try it, even just for yourself, because actually applying these improvements, even just to a practice couple of sentences, will really help you understand these issues much more than just hearing me talk about them, I promise. And when you're finished, check out some of these resources here. With a bit of digging, you can even find all of these online as free PDFs, which you did not hear from me, or you can buy them cheaply. Just do me a favor and try somewhere besides Amazon, please. You may have heard me mention this academic writing for graduate students book already. This is absolutely my number one favorite resource for formal writing in general, so especially check that one out. Now then, what are your next steps with improving your text? I am busy adding more units to our post-writing modules in the Padlet, so check those out if you're ready for that stage, and the post-writing stage, that is. And if you're ready for some feedback on your text as it stands now, do make sure you sign up for a feedback session with me, or you can also talk to your peer group at one of our check-ins or by mail. So thanks for watching this video, and be sure to add any comments or questions you have on YouTube or in the Padlet.